Now this lecture here is about, as we can see here, implementation. And according to this little overview that I have made, we are talking about objectives, task setting, communication, allocation of resources, monitoring and controlling the plan. And then we have people also being a very important part of the implementation process. Now, I would like to dig a little bit into the difference between some of the lectures here, because what I'll do in this lecture here is that I will talk about change and structure and leadership, and also over here about, of course, objectives, task and communication and resource allocation. And then in some of the lectures to come, we will dig more into the people issue here. So things like attitude, perception, motivation, etc. So today, and in this specific lecture, you need to simply just have this idea about the overall approaches on implementation. What is change? What is structure? What is leadership? So that we get this idea about what is it that goes on in an organization when we are talking about changing things in order to implement a new option, for example. Do we need to change the structure? Then what is the structure? What kind of leadership do we have in our company? And does that fit to the way we would like our company to develop? So this lecture very much about these more overall approaches for implementation. Now, most companies, they need to ask themselves, how do we survive in hostile markets? And Lynch presents us with these different approaches. For example, a survival-based strategic route. So implementing strategies or simply just being in the market-based, or in the market, could give rise for a question about how do we simply survive? And he says, well, one way is to look at it as survival of the fittest. That's the survival-based strategic route forward. And that, of course, can help us to understand how do we then want to implement things? How do we want to organize our company? And the same goes for the other approaches like uncertainty-based route. Then let's take small steps. Let's try to be opportunistic. Let's try to learn and adapt, etc. So depending on how you as a person and as a leader team would see your idea about implementing and your idea about the company being in the market, you could go for a survival-based strategic route. You could have an uncertainty-based route. You could go for a negotiation-based route and a learning-based route, learning from the past and experimenting with the future. And all of these, I would say, have a lot to do with the next thing that I'm going to show you, namely this learning-based process. And I think it's quite good to have the idea about what does it mean that we have single loop learning, and at the next slide we'll look at double loop learning. But first, let us check out what is single loop learning. So loop learning, we are scanning our environment, we are checking against operating norms, and we are adjusting against norms if necessary, and then we check again. Okay, that was one loop. And imagine that we would like to, we have a production, and in that production we want things to be done in a very specific way. So the supervisor might check, or the operator might check, am I doing things right? I'm simply checking the machine here, and I'm checking, is the machine doing what I have programmed it to do? If yes, then okay, that is okay, I have checked. If not, I'm simply adjusting the machine to go back to the norms. And then we might have these single loop learnings on a constant basis. How often do we check the machinery? How often do we check our marketing department that they are going through these checkpoints whenever they are planning on some communication. And having checked that, we need to adjust if they are not following the norms. So therefore, single loop learning is about figuring out and checking, do we do things as we are supposed to do? And we can run these loops infinitely. So that's single loop learning. Scan, check, adjust. Let's see and check what we call double loop learning. So in double loop learning, we have an extra loop. When we have this scan and check against operating norms, then we can scan, check, and say, yes, it's okay, and we go back. But we could also say, yes, we check against operating norms, but then the double loop, the extra loop that we have here, simply tell us, are you sure that you are checking the right norms? Are the norms appropriate? Let me give you another example. You can imagine that you have done your bachelor thesis, or you're going to do your master thesis. That's not so far away. And you might actually be able to do the things that you want to do in the right way. You might choose, let's say, a communication model, and you're using the model right, and you are collecting data, and you're doing your analysis, and you are checking up against the models that you have chosen to use for communication, and everything is fine. And you do the same with, let's say, motivation theory. You are using motivation theory, you are collecting data, you are figuring out how to apply the motivation theory in the right way. And you are making small adjustments on your way. And then at the exam, then the examiner might say, yes, you have applied this communication model, but is this the right model to use in this situation? And that's very often what you will experience from, well, at least I hope, what you will experience from supervisors, that supervisors are giving you double loop check questions to help you question, not whether you are doing things right, because that's pretty obvious. We more or less can all do that. But it's actually more interesting in an academic context to check, are we doing the right things? So that is also the basic difference between single loop learning and double loop learning. Over here, single loop learning is about, are we doing things right? And double loop, are we doing the right things? And you can use that for many purposes, not only in an academic way, but in lots of different aspects of life as well. Are you doing the right things? Are you doing things right? So two very good questions, also when you're doing papers, etc. So companies should use that in checking out whether they're doing things right, but also whether they're doing the right things. Because doing the right things is about strategy. And then having chosen, it's about doing things in the right way. Okay, let's try to take a closer look at how do we implement strategy. And in an implementation process, we find some main elements of that process. And these elements are, and I'll just show you here, it's about objectives, task setting, and communication. Again, imagine we're going into the German market. What objectives do we specifically have? What kinds of tasks do we need to perform? And how and what kind of communication do we need to have in order to make this option a success, namely to go into the German market? Well, an objective of 3% market share, for example, task setting. Okay, the communication department need to do this, the production department need to do that, etc. And then how do we communicate? Well, we communicate with these and these media, we use these and these approaches. So that's certainly one major part of implementation. Then we need to allocate resources, because one thing is to set objectives, but when we start talking about task setting and communication, they are not for free. So we have to figure out what kind of resources do we need to use and how do we allocate? Do we allocate more resources to our communication department, or do we allocate more resources to our production department? And how do they split the resources? So resource allocation and the discussion of resource allocation is pretty important when we are talking about implementation. Then, having set the objectives and agreed on what departments are going to do what, that's the task setting, and we have allocated resources, then we have to figure out how to monitor and control that plan. So we need to monitor, are the resources spent in the right way? We need to monitor, do we reach our objectives? We need to monitor, are we performing the tasks? Are we performing the communication? So we need to follow up on whether we reach our objectives, do what we have agreed to, and communicate the way we have. We also need to understand the resources. How much money do we spend on each of the objective, task, and communication? And in that way, we can start to control whether we are on the right track. And we might even ask ourselves in the process, are we doing this right? And we might actually throw in an extra question saying, are we really doing the right things here, trying to enter this new market? So again, a double loop learning process can actively be part of this. And in order to collect these things here, the two guys, Norton and Kaplan, they have tried to pull it all together. Means they are kind of taking all of this in the box here, and the allocation and the monitoring, controlling, into what they call the balanced scorecard. So it's a simple card, simply meaning that we try to put everything into a spreadsheet, and then we try to figure out how does it all fit together, and are we especially making sure that we are doing things and that we are on track and following the plan. So the balanced scorecard is important to notice this little sentence here, that the balanced scorecard is not a way of formulating strategy. That's pretty important, because the balanced scorecard, that's a way to keep track on what you already have decided. And therefore, the balanced scorecard is about translating our vision. It's about communicating and linking our goals and rewards. And it's about our objectives, resources, milestones, etc. So the points about a balanced scorecard is, when we're looking at this, what they said was we need to balance these strategic perspectives, which are financial perspective, customer, internal, and future. And by balancing these perspectives, it simply means that they are talking about there's a coherence between these. So when you have customer satisfaction, then how do you get customer satisfaction? Well, you can get customer satisfaction by, for example, delivering quality of your product, and you might deliver a service. And if you deliver good product, good service, customers are satisfied, and then they buy, and then we have these performance here from the financial perspective. Means we get a high return on capital, we get economic value added, we get sales growth, we get cost reductions because we can get more production, and that means economies of scale, maybe economies of scope. So the idea is that customer satisfaction, customer retention leads to the financial outcomes here, like economic added value and return on capital. And in order to get customers satisfied and retain customers with us and acquire new customers, we need to make sure that we deliver a specific product quality, that we have, for example, job turnover in order to make our employees happy, that we are looking into manufacturing costs, etc. So something that makes customers satisfied and stay with us is that we're doing a good job. And that is what we are checking out here on the internal perspective. And then in order to keep on doing a good job, we would have to look into the future perspective and examine how we can still learn and grow. And that could be about product development. It could be about core competencies within research and development. It could be about employee retention. So how do we make sure we have a good company in the future? That's here. And how are we operating today to make sure that customers are satisfied, and when they're satisfied, they will buy, and we have a healthy company and we get a good return on our capital. And in order to check up on some of these points here, Norton and Kaplan introduced what they call key performance indicators, KPIs. And you will find that word used in lots of different contexts with companies. They are constantly talking about, oh, we need a KPI for this, we need a KPI for that. So the word KPI comes from this, but is used quite widespread in lots of different contexts. And it can make a lot of sense, but this is where it kind of originated, that we have a KPI for employee retention, for example, that we need to employee retention to be at least 90%, because that means that we keep our competences in-house, and we know that the people we have in our production, they know exactly how to produce the right kind of product quality that we might have over here, and therefore we keep our turnover down regarding employees. And then we could have another KPI for customer satisfaction, that when we ask customers, customer satisfaction should be at least 4. And if we are using a scale saying to customers, please indicate how satisfied you are from a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is most satisfied. Then on that scale, we could set a KPI saying that, okay, then we have a KPI on customer satisfaction being a 4, but we have to define it. But that's the way we work with KPIs. Okay, so the balanced scorecard kind of help us keeping track on what we do implementation-wise. But remember, it's not about developing strategy. Now, strategic change, what is it, and what causes strategic change? What are some of the major resistances to change, and how do we manage strategic change? Let's try to look into these 3 overall areas here. The causes of strategic change. Of course, the environment can change. And we have a quite recent example. We have the COVID-19. That's something that happened in our environment. And that has caused a lot of companies to change. And they have to, maybe simply to survive. So they could have a vision, but right now their purpose, and lots of restaurants in Denmark have that purpose right now, to simply survive. So COVID-19 could be a change in the environment. Economy, competition, etc. could also be. It could be business relationships. We might get a new alliance. We might have met another company and we can see that our products are complementing each other. So we go into a new alliance with another company, and that would may be the cause of a strategic change. There might be new technology. We could suddenly find ourselves in a situation where the technology has changed and we can see options on that. And therefore, new technology can be the driver of changing our organization. And people, new leadership, for example. If we have a new CEO, that CEO might have different ideas about what we should do, and therefore that person can start a change process. So these are very often seen reasons for why a company is going to change. And there's a difference in a change process saying that, okay, it's a must given COVID-19, and a new leader saying that, okay, this is something we need to do. And therefore, the reasons for why we are changing can be quite interesting to look at and also help us to understand how to implement more specific parts of our new strategy. Then, can we always just change an organization? No, people tend to resist, even they can see that it might actually be a good benefit to them. So we need also to have especially change agents on board in order to help the process itself. Specific sources of resistance, we can kind of divide them into individual and organizational sources of resistance. Just a few examples here. A person that has been working with a specific issue, area, department for many years can simply resist a change out of habit. I don't feel comfortable because this is threatening my way of being in the company. So I have lots of habits, and if I have to change, I feel uncomfortable. So we can see that people are fighting changes simply out of habit, that they don't want to combine with fear of the unknown. Habit, I feel safe, I'm happy, I go to work every day. And then that could be the individual. Organizational, for example. It could be structural inertia, limited focus on change, group inertia, threat to expertise, etc. So organizational is more about the organization as such. For example, we have a group, they are used to do this and this in this way, and they never question. So they just find themselves happy in the group, and therefore they don't want this new change that someone else has initiated. So the sources of resistance is quite important to look at if we want to succeed with our implementation. Then how do we manage? Well, we have different approaches to managing change, and also given the resistance that people might have either on an individual basis or group basis. And if we look at least, I guess some of you will know Levin's 3-step model of change and Kotter's 8-step model of change. And we also have something called action research and organizational development. Now, these are ideas about how can we manage a change process. But there's also some quite good input to what we could say. These are just general input to managing strategic change. And let's start with looking at what are those general inputs. And you'll see that these general inputs are found in both Levin's and Kotter's models of change, and also action research and organizational development. So you could say that the first here, general input, is quite common sense and where we should always start. Okay, let's try to look at these general input. So if you want to overcome the resistance that any organization might have, both on an organizational wise and individual wise, communication. is number one, basically. If people don't know what happens and what is going on and what is going to happen, they tend to resist a lot. So in order to make people not resist the change, communicate with them. Try to make them participate. Make sure that you are trying to build support and commitment. Also develop positive relationships. And implementing changes fairly. Do not try to bully some people. Do not try to make it unfair that some is gaining a lot and some are losing a lot, because that is not going to work, because then people will start to resist as well. And then manipulation and co-optation, that might sound quite negative, especially the word manipulation, but it's not. It can be quite positive that you manipulate, but it has to be manipulation in such a way that the people start to see, okay, this could actually be quite positive for me as well. And especially when we are talking about people who might themselves resist simply because they have they are afraid of the unknown, as we saw earlier. And then if you can manipulate their mind to start see another perspective of the world, that would mean that that person would kind of lay off the fear of the unknown and start to see a more positive future, and thereby also contribute in a positive way to the change. So manipulation is not only negative, it can be quite positive. And we use it a lot in what is called process consultation. Then selecting who is going to be part of the process at a very early stage is really important. And of course, we can also kind of force people to do things. And it's also important to remember that change, you can ask people to change. So on a cognitive level, they would reflect on it and they will start seeing for themselves, yes, that makes sense. Or you can simply tell them to change their behavior, and then they would have to change their behavior, and then they might start thinking differently upon it. So these are the general input to a change process. And then we have Lewin and his 3-step model, where he's talking about unfreezing a situation and move and refreeze. Let's try to see, what does he mean about unfreeze and move? Well, here we have a status quo, means that is where the organization is today. It could be selling in Denmark, we have this production, we have this communication, etc. And then the management has decided we need to enter new markets, we need to change our production, we need to change our communication. And then how do we take that step from where we are today with the present employees and up to a new situation where we can start implementing our new strategy? So that means unfreezing is about loosening up for this status quo and then help people to move to a new place. Now, I think this figure here, it says that we are moving up. It could simply just move here. Doesn't really matter. What matters is that we have restraining forces and driving forces. And we need the organization to change, to go and be ready to act as an organization implementing a new strategy. So that's the important part here. And then when we are refreezing, it's simply about making sure people keep on doing what they have been doing in the process of getting to the new state. Okay. Then Kotter's 8-step plan is more or less the same thing as Lewin. I say more or less, but if we look at Kotter's process here, the first 4 is about creating urgency, form a coalition, create new vision, and communicate. And Lewin would call that the unfreezing part, these 4. And Kotter will have these ideas about create urgency, for example, establish a sense of urgency by creating a compelling reason for why change is needed. And sometimes we hear these guys talking about a burning platform. And that simply means that if you stand on a platform that's burning, then you will have to move your feet unless you get burned and die. So how can we create a burning platform that our organization understand? Well, one way is to set up a picture of the future that is so bright and delicious that people would want to go there. Or to set up another burning platform saying that, okay, if we stay here, we simply die and you're out of a job in half a year. So there are lots of ways of establishing a sense of urgency. Okay, the next step, according to Kotter, are these three here: empower others, reward wins, and consolidate improvements. And that is what Lewin would call the movement part. Let me just point a little one to this 6 here, reward wins. Plan for, create, and reward short-term wins that move the organization toward the new vision. Something that lots of organizations forget and are not really good at, but it is so important to help people understand that we are on the right way, and therefore we need to reward wins. We need to celebrate. So when we have reached part of our strategy or part of the implementation, then let's have a little celebration. Buy some cookies for the department, or give them a beer Friday afternoon, or whatever is the tradition in order to celebrate something. But make sure that people are involved and rewarded, because when you reward people by having cake and saying that, well guys, you really did a good job, that is also part of motivating your employees, and it is part to keep people motivated. And it doesn't have to cost a lot of money, but it does have to cost psychic energy from the leader, thinking about recognizing his employees and motivating them like that. The last part, that is simply to reinforce the change, and that is to refreeze. That means to, as a supervisor, manager, leader, you need to follow up and make sure that your employees, your departments are still doing what they are supposed to do according to the new strategy. Then we have action research, a simple process where you kind of try to diagnose, you make analysis, and you have feedback, and you take action, you evaluate. Very common the last 10 years that leaders are doing action research. That means that they are being part of the change process, and they're trying to be on site and online constantly, and trying to implement as they go along, doing the analysis and feedback to employees. And then we have organizational development in general, sensitivity training, not used a lot anymore, survey feedback, gathering data and acting on it, process consultation, quite much used, and lots of companies have good results with it. We use team building, intergroup development, and appreciative inquiry. And maybe this one is more different than the others, because appreciative inquiry is about appreciating what is actually working right now, and trying to figure out how do we build upon the positive sides of the organization and what is really working. So instead of talking about a problem, we are talking about recognizing what works, and then if we do more of that, the problems will go away. So it's not about not focusing on problem, it's just using another approach on developing the organization. So structure. What kind of structures do we find in our organization? You have probably heard a lot about structure, about functional structure and matrix structure. These are structures as well. But I would like to say that when we are talking about structure, it is about how we define the tasks that we have and how we formally divide the tasks that we need to perform in an organization, how we group them, how we coordinate them. And for that, we have these key elements. We have work specialization, departmentalization, chain of command, span of control, centralization, formalization, and boundary spanning. Now, the structures that you have heard, functional structure, matrix, object structure, they are all just a consequence of these 7 key elements when we are talking about how to structure an organization. Let's see what's hiding between these. This is an overview. The key question is regarding work specialization. The key question is, to what degree are activities subdivided into separate jobs? And the key question regarding departmentalization is, on what basis will jobs be grouped together? Chain of command, we have a key question over here. To whom do individuals and group report? Now, I'm not going to go through all of this, but imagine that you are answering or asking all of these questions to a company. Now, I know some of you might be going into some kind of internships in companies. So if you want to get to know the company that you are in, you could simply try and ask these questions and simply ask the contact person you have, to what degree are your activities divided into separate jobs? Because that would tell you a lot about how they specialize their jobs. And if you ask all of these questions here, these are really good questions. That would help you to understand how the company is working. And of course, it will give you a much larger insight into how the organization is working than just have an organizational diagram showing that, okay, here's the CEO, here's the departments, etc. Because that's just a truth of the moment. But when you, for example, could get an answer to this one, where does decision-making authority lie? And then you start getting explanations on, well, in this department, we make decisions in this way. And then you get explained how they make decisions. And then you can make the analysis and conclude, okay, does that mean that they have a centralized or decentralized decision-making process? And what are then the consequences to the way the company is working, and what kind of strategy they have, what kind of market they would like to serve, etc. So, basic, does the structure support what the company would like to do in the marketplace? And in order to figure that out, if they want to have be a company that develops and launch new products, then we might not find centralization of decisions in the research and development department that good, because it might actually prohibit the company in doing what they would like to do in the marketplace, namely to launch new products. So depending on how they work and see themselves, the structure should support what they do, and you can investigate their structure and how they support the strategy by asking these questions. And digging into these specific questions could be done by this. For example, describe the degree to which activities are subdivided, also known as division of labor, benefits, cost. And we have these different ideas about work specialization, that the more specialized you are, the more you might end up having an impact from human diseconomy. So there's some idea about work specialization, very low, very high, that the productivity will be somewhere in between very high specialization and low specialization. And then departmentalization. I'm not really going to go through this, but I'll try to point out specifically what you could look for. And the same goes for the rest of these points here. And 3, the chain of command. authority, unity. Span of control, how many employees is referring to each supervisor and leader, illustrated like this. And centralization, who makes the decisions, that's very centralized. We go all the way to the top. Decentralized, we can make decisions at the workplace maybe. How formal are we, or informal? Do we have freedom to act if we want to? And what about our boundary spanning? Where do we have relationships outside their formally assigned groups? And then these examples are just taking simple structure, bureaucracy, matrix. And simple structure, well, you could draw it. You could make some small boxes and try to make some lines between it. But what it normally means is that you have a low degree of departmentalization, wide spans of control, very little formalization. So startups and small companies would be found here in simple structure. And then a bureaucracy, highly routine, formal rules, regulations, centralized authority, etc. Very often seen as this triangle here with strategy, tactical, and operational levels, and people are to ask for permission before they do anything. And then functional and divisional structures. As you can see here, functional structure, CEO, production, marketing, accounting. Divisional could also be Europe, US, Asia, etc. So it's a matter of what makes sense. Does the structure here support what we would like to do in the marketplace? And this is the matrix structure. Okay, management or leadership. Let's just have a quick look at what are the differences. The role of management, that is to perform functions in organizations and hold a particular formal title and or fulfill a role. Could be a production manager. That manager has the responsibility for having the production up and running. Then a leader, the art or process of influencing people so that they will strive willingly and enthusiastically toward the achievement of the group's mission. Now, this production manager could still be performing this role as a manager, but could also have the role of a leader, simply because it's about motivating people and make them see why are we here and make sure that they are satisfied at work. Now, there are different approaches to look into management and leadership. One of the famous ones is Mintzberg, and he has investigated lots of leaders, and he found out that he could see that all leaders had managerial roles divided into interpersonal roles, informational roles, and decisional roles. And then you can simply take these roles, and if you want to investigate something about management and leadership, you could figure out, the leader motivating employees, encouraging new employees, recognizing achievements, etc. You could ask questions about this and then see, is this person a leader? Is this person a figurehead? Investigate this. And you could also, if you have a leader job, figure out, where should I prioritize to spend my time? Then we have specific leadership styles. We can be autocratic and we can be democratic. So we could join in and help, and we could simply tell people to do things. And we have Hershey and Blanchard as a situational leadership. Look down here, we have able and willing. That means we have a person who's able and willing to do the job. That simply means that we can delegate. If we at the other end have a person who's unable and unwilling, then we simply have to tell. So situational leadership is about knowing your people and then know what to do in order to make them work in the organization. And then we have the management grid by Mouton, also saying, how do we describe managers? Some can have a high concern for the production and maybe a very low concern for people. So that means that's the guy who's always pushing people. On the other hand, if we have a person who's not focusing on production, but is focusing very much on people, then we are just having a good time. So both might not really be the best, but this is a way to understand managers and leaders and how they act. And the last slide here for today is about McGregor. McGregor was talking about a theory X and a theory Y, and it's a view of other people. It's about how do managers perceive other people. And if you are a person yourself, a leader, who think that other people dislikes to work and must be forced and prefers to be directed, then you are a theory X leader. If you, on the other hand, believe that other people have self-control, are committed and responsible, then you are a theory Y leader. So it's simply a way of understanding how managers are and understand why they lead and manage the way they do. And that ends this lecture.